About 2 weeks into learning Japanese, I started using the Anki deck known as the Core 2K 6K deck. It essentially contains the 6000 most commonly used Japanese words along with an example sentence and native audio. To the best of my knowledge, the deck is made from the contents of an iknow.jp course, starting out with the complete basics such as numbers and commonly used nouns, and eventually working its way up to more advanced vocabulary such as those used in business and politics. This deck was suggested to me by a friend and I was pretty excited to jump right in. But before that, I was curious to see what other decks people on the internet might recommend. But to my surprise, probably the most common response to someone asking for deck suggestions was something like, you should make your own deck, and some even going as far as to say that using pre-made cards is a complete waste of time. And at the time, it didn't really make sense to me how a complete beginner such as myself would be able to create and curate an entire Anki deck to get me started in Japanese. I was barely even familiar with Anki and I had no clue on what sort of card formats worked the best for learning a language. And on top of that, I wasn't even sure how serious I was about learning Japanese as I was just getting started. So the labor cost of me making thousands of Anki cards just seemed really tedious and demotivating. I much more preferred to have a proper deck, made by someone who knew what they were doing, and all I had to do was to show up every day to do my spoon-fed reviews. And that's exactly what I did with the Core 2K 6K deck. And now, over 900 days later, I have nearly finished it. Which is why, in this video, I want to share my thoughts on the topic of should you use pre-made Anki cards or make your own. So, for me, the time I was able to dedicate on learning Japanese back then was quite limited, about 1 hour a day. In fact, the main reason I was able to fit learning Japanese into my day at all was thanks to apps such as Duolingo and Anki, as they were the perfect gap fillers for idle times during the day, such as when eating, during commutes, waiting for a bus to arrive, in the bathroom, and so on. I didn't have much time for daily immersion, nor was immersing at such a low level, at least without using English subtitles, even that enjoyable or profitable. Which is why the Core 2K 6K deck was my main focus, and I'll keep the story short and say that it has so far been the biggest contributor to my Japanese proficiency. So, one of the main arguments I've heard for why making your own cards is better is that because you made them yourself, you know what context they came from, and therefore remembering them becomes easier. But in my experience, this does not apply to vocabulary cards. I've made hundreds of vocab cards of my own, and I've honestly experienced no difference compared to a pre-made deck. At times, I've even felt like remembering the vocabulary cards I made myself was even more difficult than the ones in the Core 2K 6K deck. However, the story is a bit different when it comes to sentence cards. The issue with pre-made sentence cards is that to some extent they require even more context than vocabulary cards. While of course, words can also have different meanings based on the context, when you take a random sentence out of a story, it's much harder to make sense of it compared to if you at least knew where the sentence came from. This is also why most pre-made sentence cards tend to be really simplified, so you wouldn't need any further context to understand them, which is potentially limiting in terms of the value you could be getting from your sentence cards. I also feel like vocabulary and sentence cards have a different goal. Vocabulary cards don't necessarily need to teach you exactly what the word means and all of its use cases, but instead it puts the word in your awareness, so you will start recognizing and comprehending the word outside of Anki. This essentially means that if the card has the same format, it doesn't matter whether or not it was made by you or someone else, especially for very basic words, such as apple or airport. Another common argument against using a pre-made deck is that they have a lot of useless words that you'll almost never encounter in daily life. But in my experience, pretty much every word I learned from the Core 2K 6K deck, I also encountered during my immersion. It was actually pretty common for me to notice the new words I had just learned on Anki later in my immersion on the same day. And also, even if I learned some random words such as the House of Representatives, to me it was fine since eventually I'll probably want to learn it anyway, and if I don't, I can just delete it. So let's say all the cards in a pre-made deck are words that you actually wanna learn. Is there then any benefit in making your own cards? Well, ideally, you still want to learn words in an order which will help you build up your comprehension as effectively as possible, so you could start immersing with your content of choice as early as possible. This is actually one of the reasons why it's a good idea to only use a pre-made deck for about the first 1,000 to 3,000 words for the sake of building a foundation. And after that, you can start making your own cards through the content that you're immersing with. This way, you'll save a lot of time by already having built a basic foundation which makes immersion more enjoyable and valuable. And now that you're ready to make your own cards, cards, the new vocabulary that you learn will become more personalized to your immersion, increasing your comprehension for that material faster. If you're watching some kind of long anime series, it's likely that they reuse a lot of the same vocabulary in every episode. For example, if you're watching Yu-Gi-Oh, you will quickly increase your comprehension and retention rate by learning words used in card games, as you're probably going to hear words such as battle and graveyard in almost every episode, while in the Core 2K6K deck they are nearly one of the last 2 words in the entire deck. And of course, you don't have to abandon the Premade deck completely. When you encounter a new word that you want to make a card for, you can check if the Premade deck already has a card for it to save yourself some time. Also, while I think that making your own sentence cards can give you an advantage, that's not to say that you can't learn from pre-made sentence cards. You absolutely, most definitely can. I used a pre-made sentence deck made from the examples in the Day Kim's textbook, and I felt like it was really beneficial for me. I started using it alongside the textbook, so I was always able to refer back to the explanations when I needed to. Each sentence built upon the previous one and served some specific purpose. And when you're a beginner, building a deck like this is actually really difficult, which is why pre-made sentence cards can still be incredibly valuable. And like I said before, I first recommend building a foundation with pre-made cards anyway. And lastly, I don't recommend using pre-made decks made from textbooks or resources that you haven't used yourself, especially if the cards are in a format which the author of the deck personalized to themselves. For example, I tried using a pre-made deck made from an N2 grammar book, and honestly, it was a terrible idea. I was really struggling with the cards, and I already knew that it probably wasn't worth using, but I stick with it to the very end to see if I could still benefit from it. But in the end, despite trying so hard and getting so far, it didn't even matter, as the benefit I got from it wasn't really worth it. I pretty much ended up memorizing the English answer instead of intuitively understanding how those grammar points work. So instead of deleting the deck entirely, I reconstructed it as a sentence deck, which was at least a bit more useful. So I think the main takeaway is that it's completely fine to use pre-made cards as long as they're in some intuitive format and aren't intended to be used alongside some resource that you're not using. Although, after you've already built a basic foundation by using say 1 to 3000 pre-made cards, you'd probably benefit more from making cards yourself from your immersion. That way, you'll be learning new words and concepts in an order which is personalized to your immersion, which will help you increase your comprehensible input and in turn help you master the language quicker. Personally, I'm using the Core 2K6K deck, but it's not the only deck out there. I'll probably go more in depth about it in the next video, where I also wanna reveal my epic plans for learning Japanese this summer. So, I'll see you there.